Hi, this is the YouTube channel Chosa Night by me, Douglas Hall. You guys can even call me that, Chosa Night if you want to. I'm going to be talking about something very peculiar or possibly interesting. This is going to be a video game theme one, particularly to the 2011 video game called Homefront, which I have played and I enjoyed it quite a bit, both in terms of gameplay and story. Although gameplay is a little weak, but there's still some interesting aspects to it. But what I'll be talking about is the story of the game, particularly how realistic is it. It was made by Cal Studio, which was a company that was owned by the former company, or now defunct, THQ. Um, Long story short, it's basically a military invasion of the United States by a reunified Korea by the North, or pro-North reunified Korea, which has been transformed into a superpower after the reunification took place. The reunified Korean nation is known as the Greater Korean Republic, which is actually an origin from South Korea's own name, which is Daehanmin국, which a literal translation means Great Korean Nation, which actually stems back into the old Korean Empire, Daehanjeku, Great Korean Empire. So that's where the origin of the name came from. The reason why the Greater Korean Republic in the game has become a superpower because of two obvious reasons, which in turn is also the two main reasons why a reunified Korea will be so powerful eventually, which is the South's advanced technologies and the abundant supply of natural resources in the north, and of course the cheap labor in the north. It was reunified, supposedly the most Koreans in the game that wanted it under Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un was the one who achieved it. In a short amount of time, according to the game's story, it managed to take over Japan and all of Southeast Asia, giving it a reminiscent to Imperial Japan's, I think, Greater Asian Coast Prosperity Sphere during World War II. So it was giving a reunified Korea of that kind of territory in terms of, or empire, and so to speak. And supposedly Kim Jong-un in the story got a Nobel Prize for achieving the reunification in the first place. And from what I understand, it took the GKR about 5-8 years to achieve it, of that kind of status. And by that point, the army, which is still the North Koreans army, which is the Korean People's Army, had achieved 20 million troops. What else has been going on in the game's story, like prior to it, and by that point, and by the time of the game's start, the Middle East has been in a war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which destroyed much of the oil fields and the infrastructure in the area, thus greatly affecting the global economy negatively, which, that does make sense in that respect. Like a war in that area will be very devastating in the first place. And supposedly that both Iran and Saudi Arabia are nuclear armed states. The US at this point in the game's story has withdrawn their entire overseas military, particularly their Pacific forces, like the US Pacific Fleet. It's no longer in like Okinawa, like South Korea, and other places in the Pacific. Now it's all been withdrawn back to Pearl Harbor, which that hasn't been done in U.S. history since World War II. They've also been suffering a major financial issue because of a bird flu pandemic, and which caused the global economy, financial system to collapse. And eventually, the GKR supposedly launched a satellite into outer space or low Earth orbit under the gist of a new communication device or world peace, but it secretly contained a nuclear bomb, which it detonated in the Earth's atmosphere above the United States, which launched an EMP that devastated the United States' power grid, particularly the mainland United States, which is, borrowing from GoldenEye, James Bond movie, stuff like that. And so that quickly allowed the reunified Korea to launch a massive, quick invasion of the United States from, Hawaii, all of the U.S. Western states, all the way up to the Mississippi, and the reason why they stopped at the Mississippi River is because they dumped irradiated waste in the river to prevent anyone from incursioning beyond the river, west of the river. So, and the western half that's been occupied by the GKR is supposedly called the New Korean Federation of Occupied America as a puppet state, much like how Manchuria / Manchukuo was to Japan during World War II. And the game starts as a first-person character, as Jacob Roberts waking up in the GKR-controlled Montrose, California. Robert was eventually recruited by the local resistance, which eventually managed to secure jet fuel for the United States military that was scattered since the invasion, and which eventually launched a successful victory at San Francisco, which convinced the European Union to consider sending full military aid to the United States. So that's the game's story. So although the game story is very interesting, but like I said, even though the gameplay wasn't particularly great, except for a couple aspects, but I would say for the most part, and I talked about this with my friends, the game, like I said, for the most part, is not realistic. The former game developer was aware that there is a slim chance that this story might actually happen, but they described each step is like a coin toss. So like if a coin toss hits, then next step, coin toss slip, so on and so forth. So let's break things down and make things easier with the story. We're going to start telling it from each nation's perspective to make things easier. So let's start with Korea. Although Korean unification is something that most, but not all Koreans, or at least quite a bit of Koreans around the world and in both Koreas, will want, yet most, especially those in the South and living abroad like myself, wouldn't want a pro-North reunified Korea. In the story, supposedly one of the story lore in the game's universe is that K-pop stars sing propaganda songs about the government and about Kim Jong-un, like Girls' Generation, for example, at the time when the game was being developed. Public opinion in South Korea wasn't positively good with North Korea and Kim Jong-un until the 2018 summit meeting between Kim Jong-un and President Moon Jae-in. So there's that. So at the time, when the game was being developed, prior to its 2011 release, most Koreans didn't think much about that, except especially the ones in the South and those abroad. It took years, or at least a couple decades after the Korean War, for the Korean people in the North to finally see the Kim family as they are now. Whereas many Koreans after 1945, of liberation from Japan's rule during World War II, still somewhat sees that in the Choson royal family. So these things, it takes time. Like you have to put a lot of time to get these things into place how you want it to. And although there's supposedly a minority in North Korea that wants unification with the South, but yet that number is growing little by little. It wouldn't be too much of a stretch, but I could be wrong. But I wouldn't be surprised if most people in South Korea would rather see the Chosun dynasty monarchy restored to power rather than see a reunification under the North's rule. Although one thing that does make sense in the game's story is the combined economic and military power of a reunified Korea. But there is a catch though. That power, by many experts around the world, have stated it would take many years, especially since the North has poor infrastructure to begin with. For example, many of the railroads in North Korea, they haven't been updated since the Japanese occupation that ended in 1945. And that's another thing too with the economy as well, the reunified Korean economy. Would the big companies in the South, for example, Samsung and LG, for example, would they be allowed to continue and operate as they would? Which there's enough to suggest that the Greater Korean Republic economy is a mix of both Korea, similar to China, so both of communism and capitalism. But supposedly more of the South's economy still continue to exist, and I'm guessing you kind of have to, especially if you want these companies to continue the way they operate, to keep generating profits and to also develop technologically as well. Because if you have too much government oversight, then your technology may not advance that you want it to. Even though technological process will continue, but not as far as you want it to. The only other thing that does make sense in the game is the North, or the reunified Korea's nuclear capacity. Supposedly they say they have 1,000 missiles, so that is a bit of a stretch, but the nuclear option is still there. So overall, I think they got the Koreanification right, at least halfway right, or at least certain aspects. But more likely, a reunified Korea will either happen in one of two options, which is either the German reunification route, where one state collapses and the other one takes over, rebuilds it, and eventually becomes stronger as a whole, or a federation of the two, where the two states retain enough of their own individual autonomies, but yet still accord to or listen to the overall federal government or federal state that represents them as a whole. But that's a different topic in its own right, and I'll probably do another video about that. But like I said, that's a different topic. But overall, I think at least half they got right. Next up, we have Japan, Russia, and China, the countries that borders North and South Korea. Japan is weakened by the diminished U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, which this left it Japan open to annexation by Korea. Ironically, that they annexed Korea back in 1910. So it's kind of like a ironic play there, which it fits with the story at least. Although most nations around the world would greatly oppose that move, but only a few nations would actually have the capacity or capability to stop it, which is the United States, Russia, and China. It can't be Europe, specifically the UK, France, and Germany, because they're too far away geographically speaking, so the best they can do is sanctions. So it will probably be Russia and China that would do something about it. It can't be the United States, because in the game's story, they're getting weaker, so the United States is in no shape to do anything about it. Russia and China, they may not do anything about it, because in a realistic sense, because they have their own respective issues with Japan, especially since both Koreas and Japan have a shared bad history with Japan. So it wouldn't be too much of a stretch, but still a stretch for China to accept Japan being absorbed by pro-North reunified Korea. But still, there will still be a big opposition to that. But in the game's story, Russia and China, they're going through their own internal issues right now, so they can't do much to stop Korea. But they are supposedly selling military tech to the pro-North reunified Korea. But at the same time, Russia and China, they will also have mixed feelings about this, so they wouldn't fully oppose this. Like I said, since they had bad history, that stretches all the way back to the 19th century. So there's that. After that, we're moving downwards towards Southeast Asia, all of which have been either absorbed by the Greater Korean Republic or either willingly or by force. Some of the Southeast Asian nations do make at least a little bit sense, particularly those of communist or pro-Chinese sentiment, like Vietnam or Laos, for example. The rest would simply not be strong enough to resist it on their own. China wouldn't like this, even if the GKR is still friendly to them, unless they give them something in return for compensation. Same thing regarding with the Japanese annexation by Korea, or pro-North reunified Korea. If they were given compensation like territorial claims, for example, then they would fully accept what the GKR is doing. Like, for example, mainland China laid claims to Taiwan, so if the pro-North reunified Korea were to give them Taiwan, then China would be like, okay, go ahead, take it. And if the GKR would ensure to Russia, like, hey, I will say, nope, Japan is not allowed to claim the Coral Islands, like that is all yours now. Like there was no doubt about that then. Like what they did, Japan did for Kangdo regarding Korea, then there was that too. So some sort of compensation for that. So that would be that for Southeast Asia. Now let's move on to the next region.